The car hummed softly as we drove down the quiet road, the streetlights casting long shadows on the asphalt. My heart beat faster, the silence between us stretching thin. I could feel it now, a heavy presence hanging in the air, thick with tension. I watched Andrew's fingers flex over the wheel, his jaw clenched. His usual calm, steady demeanor was nowhere to be found. "Andrew," seriously I said again, more forcefully this time. "Unlock the door." "I'm not joking." But instead of responding, he just kept staring ahead, as if the words hadn't even registered. The more I spoke, the more the silence grew. It was suffocating. My breath caught in my chest as I looked at him, trying to read his face. He wasn't angry, he wasn't anything. He was numb and distant, like someone else had taken his place. The man who'd once told me that he'd never hurt me, that he would always protect me, was now a stranger beside me. I shook the door handle in desperation, but it was no use. The door wouldn't budge. I leaned back in my seat, my mind racing. What was happening? Had I missed something? Some clue? Some hint? This wasn't the man I married. I could feel my pulse quicken as the weight of it all hit me. My husband had locked me in the car, and it wasn't a mistake. It wasn't a simple misunderstanding. This was deliberate. As we continued to drive, I glanced at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something lurking behind us, something I couldn't yet understand. But there was nothing. Only the night ahead, an endless stretch of darkness, and the tight grip of uncertainty. I didn't know what was coming, but I knew deep in my gut that it was something I couldn't ignore. I felt a cold sweat break out across my forehead as I held the will in my hands, the words on the page blurring as the world around me started to spin. My stomach churned, and a sickening pit opened up inside me. I read it again, desperately hoping I had missed something, anything that would explain the changes, but it was clear. The business, the house, everything Andrew's father had built, it was all going to Patrick. And I was nowhere to be found. The sense of betrayal hit me like a slap to the face. I had trusted him, had given my life to this man, to this family. We'd built a life together, or so I thought. All the late nights, the sacrifices, the dreams we'd shared about what we'd do with the family business when the time came. It had all been a lie. Andrew had never meant any of it. It wasn't just a misunderstanding, it was a calculated decision. As I sat there in the dim light of the living room, clutching the will, I tried to make sense of everything. Had Andrew been planning this for months? Years? And why hadn't I seen it? Why hadn't I noticed the subtle shifts in his behavior, the way he'd distanced himself from me? My mind raced back to the moments leading up to that night in the car. The way he'd locked the doors, the way he'd refused to let me out. The tension in his eyes, his refusal to speak. It had all been leading up to this discovery. I had been played. I had been manipulated. And worst of all, I had been so blinded by my love for him that I hadn't seen it coming. I stood up from the couch, pacing back and forth as I tried to gather my thoughts. What should I do? Confront him? No, I couldn't. Not yet. I wasn't ready. But the anger, the frustration, it burned inside me, threatening to consume everything. I had to find out more. I needed answers. Later that evening, I watched as Andrew and Patrick sat together in the dining room, their voices low, but the tension between them was palpable. They were acting like nothing had changed, like everything was fine. But I knew. I knew now that this wasn't about just a business deal. There was something far more personal at play, something they were hiding from me. I could feel the weight of their silence pressing in on me, their smiles tight and forced whenever they turned to acknowledge me, but it wasn't enough to fool me anymore. I had seen the cracks, and now I could see through them. When Andrew left the room to take a phone call, I turned to Patrick, who was now sitting alone at the table, his eyes focused on the documents scattered before him. I couldn't help myself, I had to ask. "Patrick," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "What's going on?" He looked up at me, his gaze cool and calculating. Before his lips curled into a smile. "Nothing, just family business," he replied, his tone smooth and rehearsed. I tried to hide the tremor in my voice, but it was there. "What kind of business? What's going on with the will?" He didn't flinch, didn't break eye contact. "You wouldn't understand," he said dismissively, pushing the papers aside. But I had to understand. I had to know the truth. As he stood up and walked out of the room, I was left with the gnawing feeling that this was just the beginning, that there was so much more that had yet to be uncovered. The next few days were a blur of confusion and rage. I confronted Andrew several times, but he brushed me off with vague excuses and half-hearted apologies. He acted like nothing was wrong, like I was just being paranoid. But I knew better now. I couldn't let this go. I had to know what they were hiding. As the days passed, I began to dig deeper, searching through old letters, bank statements, and anything that could give me more answers. But the more I uncovered, the more the weight of the truth became unbearable. There were transactions I didn't understand, meetings I hadn't known about, and decisions being made without me, and it all pointed back to Patrick. What was he after? And why had Andrew allowed it to happen? Had he been in on this all along, or had Patrick manipulated him too? As I sat in my study one night, staring at the documents laid out before me, I felt a wave of helplessness wash over me. The trust I'd built with Andrew, the life we'd created, it was all slipping through my fingers. And I was terrified that, no matter how hard I tried to hold on, it was already too late. The email was a revelation, but it wasn't just the words that left me shaken, it was the sheer audacity of it. Patrick had written it like it was nothing more than a business transaction, like he was discussing inventory or scheduling a meeting. There was no remorse, no hesitation. Just a cold, calculated plan to take over what was rightfully mine. The family business, the house, the legacy my father-in-law had spent a lifetime building, it was all laid out for me to see. My inheritance, my future, was being stolen in broad daylight, and I had no idea how long this had been in the works. I read the email again, my hands trembling. I could barely comprehend what I was seeing, but the words were unmistakable. Patrick was going to use Andrew as a pawn to take control of everything. And Andrew was playing along, without question. "We'll make sure she's out of the way," Patrick had written. "It's the only way this works. She won't understand what's happening until it's too late." The last sentence hit me like a punch to the gut. She won't understand. It felt like a slap in the face, a cruel reminder of how little I meant in their plan. I wasn't just an obstacle. To them, I was an afterthought, someone who could be discarded once they had what they wanted. My mind raced. How long had they been plotting this? How long had Andrew been keeping this from me, pretending everything was normal while secretly aligning himself with Patrick? And for what? Why had he done this? The man I had married, the man I had given everything to, was he this person? Had he ever really been the man I thought he was? I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the screen, the weight of the truth settling over me like a heavy fog. The house felt quieter than usual, the silence amplifying the storm of thoughts racing through my head. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't think clearly. I felt as though I was drowning in a sea of lies and deception. I wanted to confront him. I wanted to demand answers. But something held me back. The fear. The fear that if I confronted him now, it would all fall apart. The fear that maybe I was too late. Maybe Patrick had already won, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. But as much as I feared it, I couldn't ignore what I had found. The truth was out, and I couldn't keep pretending anymore. I had to know what Andrew had to say for himself. I needed to hear it from his mouth. No more secrets, no more lies. I stood up, my legs weak beneath me, and made my way toward the bedroom. I found Andrew sitting on the edge of the bed, his back to me, his face hidden in his hands. He looked exhausted, like the weight of the world had been pressing down on him for far too long. He didn't hear me come in. I stood there for a moment, my heart pounding in my chest, wondering if I should turn back, wondering if I could just walk away, pretend I hadn't found the email, pretend that everything was still okay. But I couldn't. "Not anymore, Andrew," I said softly, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't turn around at first, but I could see his body stiffen. His shoulders were hunched slightly, like he was bracing for impact. "Andrew," I repeated, this time louder, more insistent. He turned around slowly, his eyes dark and weary. "What is it?" he asked, his voice strained as if he already knew something was wrong. I didn't waste any time. I held the phone out in front of him, the email still open on the screen. "This," I said, my voice trembling despite my best efforts to remain calm. "What is this? Tell me, Andrew. What is going on?" His face drained of color as he saw the words on the screen. I could see the guilt flicker in his eyes before he quickly looked away. "It's not what you think," he said, his voice shaky. "Then explain it to me," I demanded, stepping closer, my chest tight with a mixture of anger and betrayal. "Explain why you've been lying to me. Explain why, after everything we've been through, you'd help him take everything from me. Why, Andrew? What the hell is going on?" He didn't speak for a long time, his eyes darting around the room like he was searching for a way out. Finally, he stood up, pacing the room, running a hand through his hair, looking lost. "I didn't want it to happen like this," he muttered. "It wasn't supposed to be like this." "Like what?" I asked, my voice rising. "What were you planning, Andrew? Were you going to just sit back and let him take it all? Were you going to let him take me too?" "I didn't want to hurt you," he said quietly, his voice breaking. "I never wanted to hurt you. But it's not that simple. Patrick, he's been pressuring me, pushing me, and I didn't know what to do. I thought I could fix it. I thought if I played along, it would all work out in the end, but it just got worse, and I couldn't stop it." I stood there, stunned. I had never heard him sound so broken, so small, but I wasn't sure I could believe him. "You couldn't stop it," I repeated, my voice dripping with disbelief. "Or you didn't want to stop it." "I didn't want to lose everything," he said quietly. "I didn't want to lose Patrick's support. The business, it's the only thing I've ever known. And I was afraid, okay? I was afraid of what would happen if I didn't go along with it." The words hung in the air between us, thick and suffocating. I wanted to scream at him, to tell him how much he had betrayed me, how much he had betrayed us. But instead, I just stood there, my heart breaking all over again. The man I had loved, the man I had trusted with my life, had allowed everything to unravel for the sake of his fear. I never thought it would come to this, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know what to say to that. How could I respond? I wasn't sure if there was anything left to say. The damage was done. The truth was out, and no matter how sorry he seemed, no matter how broken he was, it wouldn't change what had happened. The future I had imagined our future was slipping away from me, and I didn't know if there was anything left worth saving. He recoiled slightly as if my words had physically struck him. The mask he had worn, the calm, collected husband, began to crack. I could see it in his eyes: guilt, regret, and something darker. He had been caught in his lies, and for the first time, he was facing the full weight of what he had done. I didn't mean for it to happen this way, he murmured, his voice barely audible now. I didn't want to hurt you, but I was trapped, too. I didn't know how to get out of this mess. The word mess lingered in the air as if he could diminish everything: our marriage, our love, our future, by reducing it to a simple inconvenience. A mess. That was how he saw the destruction he had caused. I couldn't hold back the anger anymore. The years of trust, of shared promises, of intimate moments that now felt like lies, they all came crashing down in that single moment. The anger burned hot in my chest, but there was also something else, something deeper, something I hadn't expected. A sense of betrayal so profound that it swallowed all my emotions whole. It wasn't just about what he had done, it was about what he had become. Trapped, I spat, my voice shaking with fury. Trapped? You locked me in a car, Andrew. You locked me in a car to hide what you were doing, to keep me from seeing the truth. Don't you dare tell me you were trapped. He flinched at my words, but he didn't argue. Instead, his gaze dropped to the floor. I'm sorry, he said, his voice small. I am. But you don't understand what's at stake. If I didn't do this, we would have lost everything. You would have lost everything. I corrected him. Not we. This was never about us, was it? This was about you, about your fear. You sacrificed everything we built for your own selfish need to survive, and now you're trying to sell me a story about being trapped? You're a coward, Andrew. A coward who thought he could have it all and destroy me in the process. I stepped back, the weight of the confrontation hanging heavy between us. My hands trembled at my sides as I looked at him, and saw the man who had once meant everything to me. The man who had promised to love me, protect me, and cherish me. Now, all I saw was a man willing to destroy the very thing he claimed to love for the sake of his security. I thought I could fix it, he repeated, his voice breaking again. I thought I could fix everything. I didn't want to lose you, but I didn't know how to fix it without Patrick. I was scared. The words "I was scared" rang in my ears. They were the words of a man who had made his choices and now faced the consequences, but there was no going back. There was no fix for what had been broken. Not anymore. You should have been scared of losing me, I said softly, the coldness in my voice a stark contrast to the anger that had burned within me moments before. You should have been scared of what you were doing to us, to our life, because now, Andrew, you've lost everything, and there's nothing left to fix. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with desperation. Please, don't say that. I didn't want this. I didn't want any of this. I don't care what you wanted, I snapped, stepping back further, the space between us growing wider with each passing second. You've already chosen. You've already made your decision. And it's not about what you want, it's about what you've done. The damage is done, Andrew. There's no taking it back. He stared at me in silence, as if the weight of my words had paralyzed him. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The room was filled with the sound of our breathing, his shallow and uneven, mine steady and cold. I don't know if I can ever forgive you for this, I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign, even to me, but they were true. I didn't know if I could ever forgive him. I didn't know if there was a way to rebuild what had been shattered between us. I don't expect you to, he said quietly, his voice strained with emotion. I don't expect anything from you anymore. I just wanted you to understand. I wanted to explain. No, I said, shaking my head slowly. You don't get it, Andrew. You don't get to explain. You don't get to come back from this. You made your choice, and now you'll have to live with it. We both will. The finality of my words hung in the air, and I could see him struggling with it. The realization that there was no way to undo what he had done. Nothing he said could fix this. He had crossed a line, and now he had to face the consequences of his actions. Please, he said, his voice pleading now. I never meant for it to end like this. Please don't walk away. But it was already too late. I'm not walking away, I said, turning to leave. I'm just walking out of the life we had, and I'm not looking back. As I stepped out of the room, I could feel the weight of the years of our marriage slip away behind me. The love, the trust, the promises, all of it fading into the past, like a dream I had once believed in. And as I closed the door behind me, I knew that I was closing the door on something much bigger than just my marriage. I was closing the door on the person I had once been, the one who had trusted without question. Now, all I had was the hard, cold truth and the strength to face what came next. Andrew was no longer my husband, and I was no longer the woman who had stood by his side, believing in him. What I had become now was someone different, a woman who had learned the cost of betrayal, and who had learned, finally, how to walk away. I sat in the empty house, the weight of everything that had happened pressing down on me. The silence was deafening, each tick of the clock echoing in my ears. Andrew was gone. Patrick was gone. The inheritance, the family business that had once seemed so solid and secure, was now just a pile of papers and empty promises. But it wasn't the loss of the business that consumed me anymore. It was the loss of trust. The loss of who I thought they were. I had spent so many years building a life around Andrew, around the future we were supposed to have. We had talked about it all: children, retirement, growing old together. I had believed in it, believed in him. But now, I was left with nothing but the remains of a broken trust and the painful realization that I had allowed myself to be locked in, not just in that car, but in a life I hadn't truly seen for what it was. I stood up and walked across the living room, passing the family photos on the walls. The pictures that once held so much warmth now felt like distant memories of a woman I no longer recognized. The woman who had believed that love and loyalty were enough to withstand anything. The woman who had trusted blindly and had been rewarded with betrayal. As I glanced down at the papers strewn across the coffee table, Andrew's betrayal laid out for all to see, I felt a pang of something sharp in my chest. The inheritance was gone. The business was gone. But the anger? The anger was still there. It burned beneath the surface, but it wasn't just anger at Andrew. It was anger at myself. How could I have been so blind? How could I have missed the signs, the subtle cracks that had formed in our marriage over the years? I shook my head, pushing the self-doubt away. It wasn't the time for regret. It wasn't the time for second-guessing myself. The past days had felt like a blur. I had spoken to a lawyer and made decisions I never thought I would have to make. There was no turning back now. But there was something in me that had shifted. The pain of the betrayal, the sorrow of losing my husband and my family's future. It was all starting to settle into something else, something stronger. I didn't need the business. I didn't need the legacy. What I had needed all along, was the strength to stand on my own. The truth had come crashing down like a flood, washing away everything I thought I knew. But now that the floodwaters had receded, I saw something different in the wreckage. I saw the woman I could become. Not the woman who had been manipulated and deceived, but the woman who had survived, who had learned from the wreckage, and who would rise from it stronger than before. I didn't know what my future would look like, but for the first time in years, I felt a sense of freedom. It was terrifying, but it was also exhilarating. The chains that had bound me, chains of loyalty, of love, of misplaced trust, were now gone, and I was free to rebuild, to create a life that was mine, free from the weight of betrayal. The next few weeks were a blur of legal battles, long days, and sleepless nights. I fought for what was rightfully mine, what Andrew had tried to take away from me. But more than that, I fought for my peace of mind. The inheritance? It was just a symbol of what I had lost. The real victory would come when I no longer needed it to define me. It wasn't easy. There were moments when the grief would hit me hard, when the loneliness would creep in, and I'd wonder if I'd ever be able to trust again. But I knew, deep down, that I had learned the most important lesson of all: trust starts with me. The hardest part, though, was facing the fact that I could never go back. The life I had built with Andrew was gone, and no matter how many times I replayed the events in my head, no matter how many apologies he might offer, the truth was clear: the person I had been before no longer existed. She had been buried under the weight of Andrew's betrayal, but I wasn't that person anymore. As the sun set outside the window, I stood up and moved toward the door. The house was empty, but I felt something else there now. The beginning of something new. The start of a journey that would be mine and mine alone. I didn't need Andrew. I didn't need Patrick. I didn't need the business. What I needed was to reclaim my life. And so, with the last glance at the house that had once been my home, I closed the door behind me. The past had taught me painful lessons, but it had also made me stronger. Now, it was time to move forward, to rebuild, to find myself again, to start a life where no one could lock me in. I took a deep breath and stepped into the future.